October 25, 1944. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea with a low, metallic light, the kind that turned steel decks pale and unforgiving. Off the coast of Samar, a small American task unit, Taffy 3, cut through rough water, unaware that history was about to collide with them at full speed. Among those ships was a Fletcher-class destroyer, lean, fast, and lightly armored, never designed to face a surface fleet. Its crew had trained for air defense and submarine threats, not for what waited beyond the horizon. At 0645 hours, lookouts spotted silhouettes where none should have been. Masts, pagoda towers, long gun barrels. The shapes resolved into Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships, including the massive Yamato, displacing over 70,000 tons and armed with 18-inch guns. This was not a skirmish. It was a kill zone forming in real time. The American ship accelerated, engines screaming as black smoke poured from its stacks. Salt spray whipped across the bow. Sailors gripped railings and helmets as the order to general quarters ripped through passageways. On the open deck, gun crews sprinted to their stations, boots slamming steel, fingers already blackened with grease and cordite. The 5-inch/38 caliber mounts swung outward, tracking targets far larger than anything they were meant to fight. The first enemy salvos landed short, towering columns of water crashing down like collapsing buildings. The shock hit the hull with physical force, rattling teeth and bones. Shrapnel hissed across the deck. The air smelled of oil, ozone, and fear. The ship answered back, firing star shells and high-explosive rounds, each recoil shutter traveling straight through the gun mounts into the men who served them. The destroyer laid smoke to shield the escort carriers behind it, a thin wall of white trying to hide American flat-tops from battleship guns. It was a delaying action born of necessity, not hope. Every man aboard understood the imbalance. They could see it. Feel it. The enemy's rangefinders were already dialing in. When the first armor-piercing shell struck, it tore into the ship like a fist through paper. Fire bloomed instantly. Alarms screamed. Compartments flooded. Flames crawled along cables and bulkheads. Yet the gun crews stayed exposed, silhouetted against smoke and fire, loading and firing by instinct as the deck beneath them grew hot. The destroyer had entered a fight it could not win, but the men at the guns had not yet decided how it would end. The gun crew belonged to Mount 51, a 5-inch/38 caliber gun positioned forward on the destroyer's open deck. It was an exposed station, shielded only by thin steel and distance. There was no armor worth naming. Just painted metal, open sky, and whatever courage a man carried with him. On October 25, 1944, that was all that stood between the Japanese fleet and the American escort carriers astern. The crew was young. Most were barely in their 20s. Farm boys from Iowa. Dock workers from Brooklyn. Men who had memorized procedures until muscle replaced thought. The gun captain stood rigid beside the breech, binoculars bouncing against his chest as the ship rolled. Sweat ran down his neck despite the morning wind. Powder men hauled brass shells from ready racks, each round weighing nearly 50 pounds, their gloves already scorched from repeated handling. The deck vibrated with every turn of the screws. Smoke from the stacks drifted low, stinging eyes and throats. Orders came clipped and sharp through the sound-powered phone, range changes, bearing adjustments, target shifts as the enemy closed fast. The mount trained and elevated, gears whining, the barrel cutting through smoke toward cruisers whose guns could erase the ship in seconds. They fired continuously. The recoil slammed back, a blunt force that shook bones and loosened teeth. Spent casings clanged across the deck, rolling until kicked aside. Cordite fumes mixed with salt air, thick and metallic. Each shell left the barrel screaming, a brief, violent hope hurled toward steel giants miles away. The crew knew the numbers. They had been trained on them. A 5-inch gun versus 14-inch and 18-inch battleship rifles was not a contest. It was defiance measured in seconds. Still, no one stepped back. No one hesitated. They worked in rhythm: load, ram, fire, eject, until hands bled and shoulders burned. Fragments from near misses began to rake the deck. Shards of steel sliced into bulkheads and lifelines. One man went down hard, helmet spinning away as blood streaked the non-skid. He was dragged clear without ceremony. There was no pause. The gun did not stop. The crew closed ranks and kept feeding it. Above them, enemy shells shrieked overhead like passing trains. Below, the ship shuddered as hits landed elsewhere, the steel deck briefly alive beneath their boots. Flames were already visible aft, black smoke rising in thick columns. The sea around the ship boiled with splashes, white and violent. The gun crew stayed where they were because leaving meant more than saving themselves. It meant the carriers behind them, slow, lightly armed, crowded with pilots and planes, would be naked. This mount, this patch of steel, had become a shield. As another enemy salvo closed in, closer than the last, the gun captain raised his arm again and called for fire, knowing the next hit might come directly for them. At 0700 hours, the Japanese gunners found their range. The ocean around the destroyer erupted without warning, walls of water rising higher than the mast. The near misses were no longer distant. They were walking in. Each impact came closer than the last, tightening an invisible noose around the ship as enemy fire adjusted with mechanical precision. The first direct hit struck without ceremony. A heavy shell slammed into the starboard side near the forward superstructure, detonating on contact. The blast punched inward with a concussive force that felt like the deck itself had been lifted and dropped. Men were thrown flat. Tools and shell casings became airborne. The shockwave raced through steel passageways, snapping lights, rupturing pipes, and tearing insulation free in a storm of debris. For a split second, sound disappeared. Then it came back all at once, metal screaming, steam venting, alarms howling. Smoke burst upward through deck seams in thick black coils. Paint blistered instantly. The smell was overwhelming, burning oil, scorched wiring, and hot steel. The gun crew felt the hit before they understood it. Their mount jolted violently, training gears grinding as the ship yawed. One loader was slammed against the shield, breath knocked from his lungs. Another went down hard, stunned, ears ringing, helmet cracked. Blood streaked across the non-skid, dark and slick beneath scrambling boots. Damage control parties moved immediately, faces already smeared with soot. Fire hoses snaked across the deck as men fought flames spreading along cable runs. Below decks, compartments flooded as ruptured lines poured seawater into the ship's wounded interior. The destroyer began to list slightly, a subtle but unmistakable shift felt through every footstep. Enemy salvos continued to fall. The Japanese cruisers had locked on, their guns firing in deliberate rhythm. Shells passed overhead with a tearing sound, a low, rising scream that ended in thunder. Each one carried the promise of another hit, another rupture, another fire. The gun crew never left their post. They dragged wounded men clear and closed the gaps without being told. The breach opened. A new shell was rammed home. Fire again. The barrel glowed faintly through the smoke. Sweat mixed with grime and blood on their faces, streaking downward as the ship pitched. Orders crackled through the sound-powered phone: maintain fire, protect the carriers, stay in position. The men did not need reminding. They could see the escort carriers behind them, silhouettes barely visible through smoke screens, slow and defenseless against battleship guns. Another shell struck aft. The blast sent a column of fire skyward, black smoke climbing fast. The destroyer was now visibly burning, wounded and exposed, yet still charging forward into enemy fire. The first hit had not broken the ship. It had changed the fight. And as the Japanese guns thundered again, closer than before, every man on deck understood that the next impact might not give them time to recover. Below decks, the destroyer became an oven. Ignited cables dripped fire along passageways. Steam roared from ruptured lines, scalding the air. Men crawled through darkness with flashlights taped to helmets, breathing through smoke so thick it tasted metallic. Water sloshed knee-deep in compartments punched open by the hit. Paint peeled from bulkheads, insulation burned like paper. Damage control teams moved by memory and touch, not sight. They dogged hatches, rigged shoring, and fought fires that refused to stay dead. Every breath burned. Every step threatened collapse. Above them, the guns still fired. The ship lived, barely. The horizon burned brighter. Dawn revealed no mercy in the light ahead now. The main fire raged amidships, fed by oil and broken ventilation. Hoses lost pressure as pumps faltered. Ammunition hoists jammed, power flickered. A chief petty officer shouted orders that vanished into the noise. Men passed buckets hand to hand until their arms failed. Smoke rolled low, forcing sailors to the deck, eyes streaming. Someone screamed from a flooded compartment. No one could reach him. Another explosion aft shook the hull and deepened the list. Control reports turned grim. Flooding spread faster than the pumps could answer. The destroyer's heartbeat power, pressure, balance began to fail. On the mess deck, stretchers filled with burned and blasted sailors. Corpsmen worked without pause, sleeves soaked, faces gray. Plasma ran short. Morphine was rationed by necessity. The smell of scorched flesh mixed with fuel oil. Over the loudspeaker came clipped damage reports and the distant thunder of guns. Somewhere above, another 5-inch mount went silent. The ship shuddered again. Men braced, waited, counted heartbeats. The heat pressed closer. So did the enemy. Damage control was losing ground. Still, the guns forward answered every call. Carriers loomed astern, their decks crowded with aircraft. Every minute bought here spared them. That truth hardened faces. No one said it aloud. Command knew the math. If fire reached the magazines, there would be no ship to save. Orders came to flood spaces, to buy minutes. Valves were spun with bare hands. Steam scalded skin. Men held doors shut against pressure and heat. Above, smoke screens thinned under wind and fire. Enemy salvos walked closer. The ship's list worsened. Gyros drifted, steering grew heavy. Electrical power failed in sections. Phones crackled, then went dead. Someone asked about abandoning ship. No answer followed. The forward gun crew kept firing. They could feel the deck sag beneath them. And they stayed. Time narrowed to seconds. Fire crept along cableways toward the forward magazines. Damage control chiefs shouted for phone that never arrived. Water hissed into flame and vanished. Bulkheads glowed dull red. Another hit was coming. The air trembled with it. On deck, the gun captain wiped smoke from his eyes and signaled again. The mount trained. The breach closed. Hands moved by drill alone. Below, fires roared unchecked. Above, the sea flashed white with near misses. The ship was burning through its last margin. And the next blow would decide everything. The order came through broken circuits and shouted relays, carried by men running through smoke. Abandon ship. The words were simple, drilled into every sailor from the first day aboard. They were not spoken lightly. On October 25, 1944, off Samar, they meant the ship was no longer expected to survive. The destroyer was dying in sections. Fires raged uncontested below decks. Flooding had spread past containment. The list increased, slow but relentless, pulling men toward the rail as the deck tilted under their boots. Smoke reduced daylight to a dim gray haze. The sea around the hull churned with shell splashes and debris. Japanese guns still fired with steady discipline, their salvos passing close enough to be felt in the chest. Life rafts were cut loose. Nets were thrown over the side. Wounded men were guided aft, some walking, some carried, some dragged. Officers moved through the chaos, voices hoarse, checking compartments that no longer answered. The loudspeaker crackled, went silent, then crackled again. Abandon ship. Abandon ship. Men hesitated, not from fear, but from calculation. Leaving the ship meant leaving the fight. It meant the thin shield between the escort carriers and the Japanese fleet would vanish. Sailors looked back toward the bow, where the forward gun still fired, its sharp reports cutting through the roar of flames and sea. Smoke poured around it, yet the mount continued to track targets, the crew refusing to break their rhythm. The captain made the decision clear. Those not essential to keeping the guns firing were to go. There would be no order for the gun crews. They already understood. Some sailors paused at the rail, hands gripping lifelines, torn between survival and duty. One by one, they went over the side, disappearing into oil-streaked water. Others turned back, drawn by the sound of the gun. Ammunition was still being fed forward. Orders were still being passed by hand. The ship still answered the helm, barely. Enemy fire intensified as the smokescreen thinned. Shells walked closer. One struck near the stern, blowing men into the water and tearing open compartments already flooded. The destroyer shuddered, then steadied. Flames reached higher, licking its signal halyards and antennae. The smell of burning paint and fuel hung thick, clinging to skin and uniforms. The abandoned ship order echoed again, carried by runners whose eyes told the truth before their mouths did. There was no anger in the air. No panic. Only urgency. Sailors clasped shoulders, nodded once, and separated. Some would swim. Some would stay. At the forward mount, the gun captain heard the order and did not repeat it. He watched his crew, faces blackened, eyes raw, hands steady. No one asked what to do. The breach opened. Another shell slid home. The mount fired again, defiant, stubborn, impossibly small against the fleet bearing down on them. The ship's deck was now hot to the touch. Ammunition dwindled. The sea rose closer with every degree of list. And still the gun spoke. As the last boats pulled away and the next enemy salvo closed in, the destroyer remained in the fight, its fate sealed, its guns unmanned by fear. The forward deck had become a furnace. Smoke pressed low, turning daylight into a dull, choking haze. The destroyer no longer felt like a ship moving through water, but a wounded machine fighting gravity and fire at the same time. Yet at Mount 51, the gun was still alive. Its crew stood where they had stood since first contact, boots planted on steel slick with oil and blood. No order was given to stay. None was needed. The gun captain checked his men with a single glance. Faces were blistered. Eyelashes burned short. Helmets were dented, paint scorched black. One sailor worked barehanded after his gloves burned away, palms raw, fingers trembling only when the gun was between cycles. They could hear shouting from aft as more men went over the side. They could feel the ship settling lower with every minute. Still, the routine held. Target bearings came by shouted estimates now. The sound-powered phone was dead. Range was judged by eye and instinct. Japanese cruisers cut through smoke like moving cliffs, their gun flashes stabbing orange through the gray. Each time a salvo fired, the pressure hit seconds later, a deep thump that shook ribs and teeth. The mount trained again. Elevation adjusted. The breech clanged shut. Fire. The gun spoke into the smoke, 5-inch shells arcing out toward ships that could erase this destroyer with a single hit. No one pretended it was equal. It wasn't meant to be. The mission was delay. Confuse. Distract. Force the enemy to fight a ship that should have been running, while escort carriers clawed for distance behind them. A shell burst close enough to lift the bow. Shrapnel sliced across the deck, punching holes through splinter shields and lifelines. One fragment caught a loader in the shoulder and spun him sideways. He was dragged clear, teeth clenched, blood soaking his sleeve. Another man stepped into his place without a word. The rhythm did not break. Smoke poured from below through open seams. The deck grew hotter, soles softening, metal radiating heat through boots. The list worsened. Water washed across the bow, mixing with ash and fuel oil. The ship answered the helm sluggishly now, but it still answered. Somewhere aft, another explosion rolled. The destroyer flinched like a living thing. Flames leapt higher, licking toward the forward superstructure. Ammunition supply slowed as hoists failed completely. Shells were passed hand to hand from ready racks, men leaning into the slope of the deck to keep balance. Each man knew what staying meant. There would be no rescue for them if the ship went under fast. No time to reach the rail. No life raft waiting. The calculation had already been made. They stayed because the carriers were still in range. They stayed because the gun could still fire. As the Japanese formation adjusted again and a new salvo thundered out closer than any before, the gun captain raised his arm, locked eyes with his crew, and gave the signal to fire once more, knowing this time the sea itself seemed to be holding its breath. By now, the destroyer was fighting without sight. Smoke smothered the forward deck so completely that the horizon vanished. Enemy ships were no longer shapes, only flashes, brief orange wounds in the gray, followed by the delayed concussion of heavy guns. The crew fired at sound and instinct, reading the battle through vibration and pressure rather than vision. Heat radiated from every surface. The gun barrel burned to the color of old iron, its metal alive under the hands that worked it. The deck blistered. Paint smoked. Sails softened and stuck. Each movement required force, as if the ship itself resisted being used any longer. Men breathed shallow to avoid choking. Words were useless now. Signals were gestures. Commands were touch and timing. Then the ammunition began to cook. A sudden crack echoed from below, sharp and wrong. A ready locker detonated aft, blowing steel outward and sending fragments spinning through smoke. The blast punched the air flat. Flames surged higher, fed by exposed powder. Another explosion followed, closer this time, rattling the mount and forcing the crew to brace hard to stay upright. They knew what it meant. Ammunition exposed to heat would not wait. Every second increased the chance that the next detonation would be at their feet. The gun fired again. Shells were fewer now. Each round mattered. Loaders passed them carefully, hands slick, arms shaking from exhaustion and heat. The breech slammed shut. Fire. The recoil came back harder than before as the ship's forward momentum slowed. A shockwave rolled across the deck as an enemy shell burst close aboard, showering the mount with fragments that rang like thrown gravel. A man screamed as shrapnel tore through his leg. He collapsed, clutching useless flesh. He was pulled aside and pressed flat against the deck, seawater poured over him to cool burns. No one looked away for long. The next shell was already moving. Below, fires raged uncontrolled. Damage control had ceased to exist as an organized effort. Compartments were abandoned to flame and water. Smoke rose through vents and seams, a living thing that refused to be beaten back. The ship's list deepened another degree. The sea slapped higher against the hull. The destroyer felt heavy, tired, as if it knew what was coming. Enemy salvos tightened. The time between muzzle flash and impact shortened until there was no warning at all. One shell passed so close overhead it peeled paint and tore antennae free. Another struck the water at the bow and collapsed inward, drenching the crew and briefly clearing the smoke just long enough for them to see the enemy cruisers still turning to engage them. The gun captain wiped his eyes with a blackened sleeve. His voice was gone. He raised his arm instead. Fire. The last ready rounds were stacked nearby, dangerously close to flame. Passing them was a gamble. Leaving them was worse. The mount continued to work, blind and defiant, as explosions walked closer and the heat climbed toward the point where steel would give. Somewhere inside the ship, a deeper rumble began, slow, heavy, unmistakable. The sound of something vital failing. And the men at the gun understood that the next explosion would not be near them. It would be them. The destroyer no longer fought for itself. That moment had passed. Now it fought for time. Behind the smoke and flame, the escort carriers turned away, their slow screws churning desperately as pilots and deck crews watched the battle unfold in stunned silence. They could see the destroyer's fire. They could hear the thunder of enemy guns. Every second that small ship remained between them and the Japanese fleet was a second bought in blood. The forward gun fired again, then again, its reports echoing hollow against the roar of burning steel. The crew could no longer feel the recoil properly. Their bodies were numb, their senses dulled by heat and concussion. Still, they tracked targets as best they could, aiming not to destroy but to harass, forcing cruisers to maneuver, drawing fire away from the carriers' thin hulls. Enemy ships shifted course in response. That mattered. Even a few degrees of turn disrupted firing solutions. Even a moment's hesitation forced the Japanese gunners to recalculate. The destroyer's sacrifice bent the shape of the battle, just enough. The sea around the ship churned violently now, torn apart by shell splashes. Columns of water collapsed inward, drenching the deck and briefly cooling scorched steel. For seconds at a time, smoke thinned, revealing the full scale of the enemy: towering hulls, massive superstructures, guns trained relentlessly forward. The sight was overwhelming. The destroyer looked impossibly small by comparison. Another salvo struck close aboard. The shock threw men against the gun shield. One sailor lost his footing and nearly went over the side, saved only by a hand grabbing his collar. Flames surged higher amidships, and the list deepened again. The deck angle forced the crew to lean hard into their work, every movement uphill. Ammunition was nearly gone. Each remaining shell was passed forward with care, knowing there would be no replacement. The gun captain counted silently. He knew how many rounds remained. He also knew how long the carriers needed. Far astern, the escort carriers finally began to slip from sight, swallowed by distance and smoke. Their aircraft, unarmored, irreplaceable, were safe for the moment. The destroyer had done its job. But the enemy did not disengage. Japanese guns continued to hammer the ship, now with brutal certainty. Shells tore through already burned sections, ripping away what little structure remained. Fire roared unchecked. The hull groaned under the strain, steel popping like rifle shots as it warped. The forward gun fired one of its last rounds. The recoil staggered the mount. Men clung to railings to stay upright. The sea rushed closer, slapping against the bow with increasing urgency. The crew stayed because there was nowhere else to stand that mattered. As the carriers vanished beyond the smoke and the Japanese fleet closed in for the final blows, the destroyer remained between them, burning, broken, and still defiant, holding the line with nothing left to give but its life. The guns stopped first. It was not an order. It was inevitability. Ammunition was gone. Power was failing. The forward mount sagged at an angle that no longer made sense, its barrel scorched dark, its steel warped by heat and shock. Smoke thinned suddenly, torn away by wind and motion, and with it came a silence so sharp it rang louder than gunfire. Enemy shells no longer fell around the ship. The Japanese fleet had turned away, chasing larger prizes. The destroyer was no longer a threat. It was no longer even a target. It drifted alone on a broken sea, burning, flooded, and barely afloat. What remained aboard was ruin. The deck was a map of violence: twisted metal, shattered fittings, burned paint flaking away in brittle sheets. Lifelines hung slack or gone entirely. The smell lingered everywhere: oil, smoke, salt, and something heavier that clung to the back of the throat. The forward gun crew stood where they had fought, now motionless, hands resting on hot steel as if grounding themselves in what was real. Below decks, the fires burned lower but wider. Compartments were lost beyond saving. Water filled spaces where men had lived and worked hours earlier. The ship's list deepened until the horizon tilted unnaturally, pulling everything toward the starboard side. Loose gear slid and crashed. The destroyer made sounds like a wounded animal, groaning, popping, hissing. Men who had gone over the side earlier watched from the water, faces streaked with oil, heads barely above the swell. They counted survivors as they surfaced. They looked back at the ship they had left and saw only smoke and flame. Some shouted. Some waved. No one answered. On deck, the remaining crew moved slowly now, conserving strength they did not have. There was no more fighting to do. Only waiting. Wounded men were laid flat where the heat was least, seawater poured over burns, pressure applied to bleeding that would not stop. Corpsmen worked silently, hands steady, eyes hollow. Personal things lay scattered where they had fallen: helmets cracked open, letters soaked and unreadable, dog tags half buried under ash. A pair of gloves rested beside the gun shield, fingers stiffened by heat, never picked up again. These were the things the crew left behind without meaning to. The sea pressed closer with every minute. Water washed across the deck now, ankle deep, then calf deep, cold against scorched skin. The destroyer's bow dipped and did not rise again. Somewhere deep inside, something gave way with a long, tearing sound. Steel surrendered to gravity. The silence held. No guns. No orders. Only the sound of water claiming what fire had not. The men who remained understood there would be no rescue in time. The ship had bought its fleet the distance it needed. That was enough. As the destroyer began its final roll and the sea climbed higher across the deck, those still aboard looked once more at the forward gun, blackened, empty, and undefeated, and prepared to follow the ship into the water, knowing history would remember the noise, but not this quiet moment before the end. The destroyer slipped beneath the surface without ceremony. No final explosion marked its passing. No dramatic flare. Just steel surrendering to gravity, fire hissing out as seawater rushed in, and a shape that had once cut waves disappearing into the deep off Samar on October 25, 1944. When the bow went under, it carried with it the last echoes of gunfire that had changed the course of a battle. The men who survived were pulled from the water hours later, oil-blackened and burned, some barely conscious. They spoke little. Shock sat heavy in their chests. What words could explain why a small escort group had faced battleships and lived? Or why a gun crew stayed when they were free to leave? The answers would not come easily, and for some, not at all. In the hours that followed, the scale of what had happened began to surface. The Japanese fleet, confused and delayed, had broken off the attack. The escort carriers survived. Aircraft were saved. Pilots lived to fly again. An invasion continued because a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts had refused to act like victims. Among them, one gun crew had held its post until there was nothing left to fire. Reports were written later, stripped of smoke and fear. They spoke of aggressive action, of torpedo runs, of accurate fire under impossible odds. Medals followed. Citations were read aloud in quiet offices far from the sea. Names were carved into paper and later into stone. But none of that captured the heat of the deck, the sound of ammunition cooking off below, or the moment when staying became a choice rather than an order. What endured was not the ship, but the space it bought. Minutes that stretched into survival. Confusion forced onto an enemy that should have crushed them. Courage that did not rely on victory to justify itself. The gun crew's stand became part of a larger truth about the battle off Samar, that discipline and resolve could bend even overwhelming force. Years passed. The war ended. The ocean closed over the wreck and kept it. The men went home, some scarred, some silent, some never truly leaving the sound of that gun behind. Others never returned at all, their final station marked only by coordinates on a chart and memory carried by those who lived. Today, no smoke rises over Samar. The sea looks calm, indifferent. But beneath it lies the proof of what happened when retreat was reasonable and resistance was chosen anyway. The destroyer rests where it fell, its forward gun pointed toward the enemy it faced, empty but unbroken. The legacy of that gun crew is not found in how loudly they fought, but in how long they stayed. When abandonment meant survival and duty demanded something else, they chose the harder ground. They did not turn away. They did not step back. They held the line until there was no line left to hold. And in that decision, made without witnesses, applause, or certainty, they ensured that others would live, and that this battle would be remembered not for the ships lost, but for the men who stood fast when the sea itself seemed to rise against them.